For this Sunday, we have the Gospel passage from Matthew chapter 22, 1 to 14, a parable of the wedding feast. God will never cease preparing and providing this rich feast of His Son. For true happiness comes when we realize with St. Paul that I can do all things in Him who strengthens me. Let us rejoice and be glad that He has saved us. Let's compare Matthew chapter 22, 1 to 14, the parable of the wedding feast, and the parable of the great banquet from Luke chapter 14, 15 to 24. In Matthew 22, 1 to 14, the parable of the wedding feast, a king invites guests to a wedding feast for his son. The invited guests refused to come, and some even mistreated and killed the king's messengers. The king invites everyone from the streets, both good and bad, to fill the banquet hall. One guest without proper dress is cast out in darkness, emphasizing the importance of being prepared and appropriately dressed. In Luke chapter 14, 15 to 24, a parable of the great banquet, a man prepared a great banquet and invited many guests. The invited guests make excuses and decline the invitation. The man then invites the poor, crippled, blind, lame from the streets and highways. The original invited guests miss out on the banquet due to the excuses and unavailability. Let's see how this passage from Matthew and Luke, the parable of the wedding feast and the parable of the great banquet, could be applied in a day-to-day Christian life. God's all-inclusive invitation. Just as the king in Matthew's parable invited everyone, God invites all of us into His kingdom, regardless of our past or status. The invitation is open to everyone. There is no club. There is no exclusivity. God's all-inclusive invitation is open to everyone. Being prepared for God's invitation. The parable in Matthew emphasizes the importance of being ready and properly dressed or attired in our lives. We must be spiritually prepared for God's invitation, dressed in the virtues of love, compassion, and humility. Just pause for a moment. Look into your closet, your wardrobe, the types of dress you have for different seasons. When you go for a wedding, how do you dress yourself? When you go for a party, how you dress yourself? For the spiritual banquet, God wants us to be dressed in the virtues of love, compassion, and humility. Responding to God's invitation, just as the invited guest had the choice to accept or decline the king's invitation, we have the choice to respond to God's call. We must choose to accept His invitation by living a life in alignment with His teachings. We can only say, I respond to God's call when we choose to align with His teaching in our lives. Welcoming the unlikely guest. In both Matthew and Luke, we see how the invited guests initially declined the invitation. The parables challenges us to reach out to marginalized, the overlooked, and the forgotten, embracing them into the community of faith. Do we go beyond our doors? Do we go beyond our comfort zone to welcome the marginalized, the forgotten, and embrace them into a community of faith? Missed opportunities and grasping God's invitation. The guests in the parables missed out on a great feast due to various reasons. They have their own excuses. We must not miss out on God's invitation by being preoccupied with worldly concerns, distractions, or excuses. Just grasp the invitation and experience the joy of communion with God. The essence of the parable of the wedding feast and the great banquet is to respond to God's invitation with a heart ready to embrace His grace and love.